Brazil. The fifth largest country on Earth, the sixth most populous. The largest in South America, the largest Portuguese-speaking nation in the world, and the most misunderstood. Because when most people think of Brazil, they think of one image: the beaches, the carnival, the football. And that image is real, but it is the surface. The part of Brazil that Brazil shows the world because the world wants to see it. Beneath that surface, there is another Brazil, a country of extremes so violent that they exist side by side without apology. A country where the most breathtaking beauty shares a fence with the most profound failure. Where what the world sees and what is actually happening are two completely different things. Where people have built lives in places that should not be livable, and where livable places have been made uninhabitable. Where nature has done things that nature is not supposed to do, and where humans have done things to nature that cannot be undone. Brazil is a country that will take your breath away, and then show you exactly why that breath comes at a cost. We went looking for the Brazil that exists when the cameras are pointed somewhere else. Not because the postcard is wrong, but because the postcard is only the beginning. And what comes after it is more interesting than anything you have been shown. Favela Rocinha, Rio de Janeiro. From the highway, it comes up all at once. A wall of houses climbing the hillside, orange and pink and gray, pressed together with no gaps and no space between them, packed so tightly the eye takes a moment to sort it out. This is Rocinha, the largest favela in Brazil. Somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 people live here. The 2022 census counted about 72,000, while residents put it far higher. On a steep hill in São Conrado, one of the wealthiest parts of Rio de Janeiro. The beach just below São Conrado is where Rio's upper class sunbathes, and the apartments overlooking it sell for millions. From those apartments you can see Rocinha. From Rocinha you can see them. The gap between the two, measured in meters, is one of the shortest and least crossable distances in the city. Rocinha runs much of its own life. Its own shops and schools, its own largely unofficial electricity grid, its own rules. For decades, it had its own government too. The drug factions that controlled the favela taxed businesses, settled disputes, and provided a kind of security in place of a state that never showed up. The state did eventually arrive. In 2011, the pacifying police unit moved into Rocinha and set up a permanent presence. Then, in 2017, a turf war between rival factions brought the army onto the streets, armored vehicles rolling over the same hills where kids play football. The army left, the factions renegotiated, and Rocinha carried on, as it has through everything since it began forming in the 1930s. When the first residents settled the hill because the flat land was already taken and built upward because there was nowhere else to go. Amazon deforestation, the lungs that are burning. From space you can see it, not the trees, the fires. thousands of them burning at once across the Amazon basin, the satellite images thick with smoke rising from fires set deliberately by farmers clearing land. It happens every year. The Amazon rainforest covers about 5.5 million square kilometers, the largest tropical rainforest on Earth and home to something like 10% of all known species. More life packed into it than almost any ecosystem ever cataloged. And it's shrinking. Since the 1970s, roughly a fifth of it has been cleared, an area well over 800,000 square kilometers. The trees come down mostly to make pasture for cattle. Brazil is the world's largest beef exporter. The logic is blunt. A hectare of standing forest earns less than a hectare of grazing land. So the forest falls, the pasture spreads, and the beef ships out to supermarkets in Europe, China, and the United States. In 2019, Brazil recorded more than 80,000 fires in a single year, a 77% jump on the year before, with tens of thousands of them in the Amazon itself. In August, the smoke drifted south and turned the sky over São Paulo dark in the middle of the afternoon, as if night had come hours early. Scientists warn that the Amazon is closing in on a tipping point, a level of deforestation somewhere around a fifth to a quarter of the forest, beyond which it can no longer generate enough of its own rainfall to keep itself alive. Past that line, much of it wouldn't decline slowly but flip, within decades, into savanna, dry grassland where rainforest used to be. And the fires are still burning. Yanomami, the genocide happening now. The Yanomami have lived in the Amazon for thousands of years, around 30,000 people in some 400 villages, spread across 9.6 million hectares of rainforest in the states of Amazonas and Roraima, on the border with Venezuela. They're one of the largest, relatively isolated indigenous peoples in South America. For most of their history, they were left alone. The forest was too remote, the territory too vast. And for much of the 20th century, the government was officially committed to protecting them. Then, gold was found. This isn't recent. The first major invasion of garimpeiros, illegal gold miners, came in the 1980s, when up to 40,000 of them poured onto Yanomami land with no permission and no legal right. They brought diseases the Yanomami had no immunity to: measles, malaria, influenza. In that first wave, roughly a fifth of the Yanomami died within about 7 years. The territory was officially demarcated in 1992, and the miners were largely expelled. Then they came back. By 2021, thousands were operating inside Yanomami land again. By some estimates, as many as 20,000, poisoning the rivers with the mercury they used to separate gold from sediment. Mercury builds up in the fish, and the fish are what the Yanomami eat day after day. In January 2023, the incoming Brazilian government declared a public health emergency in Yanomami territory and sent in medical teams. What they found was children with severe malnutrition, bodies far below the weight they should have been, and diseases that are routinely treated everywhere else in Brazil, killing people who had no access to care. Over the 4 years to 2022, at least 570 Yanomami children died, most from preventable causes. The mining had wrecked the rivers, the fish were gone or poisoned, and the game had been scared off by the noise of the machinery. A food system the Yanomami had maintained for thousands of years was pulled apart within a few. By people chasing gold for a market the Yanomami have never had any part in. Iguazu Falls. The waterfall that makes Niagara look small. When Eleanor Roosevelt first saw Iguazu Falls, she's said to have looked at all that water and exclaimed, "Poor Niagara." Whether she really said it or not, anyone who has stood at both tends to understand the sentiment. Iguazu isn't really a waterfall. It's a system, 275 separate falls strung across about 2.7 kilometers of cliff on the border between Brazil and Argentina, one of the largest waterfall systems on Earth. The flow averages around 1,500 cubic meters a second, and in flood can surge to roughly 13,000, some 13 million liters going over the edge every second. The sound carries for kilometers. The mist climbs tens of meters into the air and effectively makes its own weather, keeping a permanently wet microclimate on the far bank, where the rainforest grows denser and greener than the forest around it, fed by the spray. The Devil's Throat, Garganta del Diablo, is where the water concentrates. A U-shaped chasm about 150 meters wide, 700 meters long and 82 meters deep, with 14 falls pouring into it at once. You can stand on the walkway at its lip and look straight down into the white. See nothing but falling water, feel the vibration come up through your feet, and understand exactly why the Guarani, who lived here for centuries, called the place Iguazu. Big water, which standing there is about all the description it needs. Lençóis Maranhenses, the desert that fills with water. It looks like a desert, white sand dunes rolling to the horizon, almost no vegetation, almost no life. For half the year, that's exactly what it is. Then the rains come, and the water has nowhere to go. Beneath the sand lies a layer that won't let it drain away, so it stays, collecting in the valleys between the dunes and building up week by week until the hollows fill into lakes. Not shallow puddles, but deep pools, emerald and turquoise and blue, held between dunes the rain hasn't washed flat. Because the water doesn't slump the sand, it simply gathers in the troughs between. This is Lençóis Maranhenses, in the state of Maranhão, in northeastern Brazil. Around 70 kilometers of coastline, reaching some 50 kilometers inland. Roughly 1,500 square kilometers of white sand that fills every year with hundreds of lagoons. The name means bed sheets, and from above, that's what it looks like. White and rumpled, like an unmade bed, with water caught in every fold. Fish live in these lagoons, including species that ride out the dry months buried in the damp sand, dormant, waiting for the water to come back. And it always does. To the same valleys, the same hollows, refilling the same lagoons that vanish and form again, year after year, as far back as anyone here can remember. A desert that becomes a lakeland and turns back into a desert every 12 months. Pantanal, the world's largest wetland. There are more jaguars per square kilometer here than anywhere else on Earth. Not in the Amazon, but here, in the Pantanal. It's the largest tropical wetland in the world. Somewhere around 150,000 to 200,000 square kilometers of floodplain in the heart of South America. Across the Brazilian states of Mato Grosso and Mato Grosso do Sul, and spilling over into Bolivia and Paraguay. When the rains come, most of it floods. The rivers overflow and the plain turns into an inland sea dotted with islands of trees, where the animals that can't swim wait for the water to drop. The ones that can swim do well. There are something like 10 million caimans here, the largest gathering of any crocodilian on Earth. So many that from the air, the rivers can look like they're moving. There are giant river otters, the largest of the weasel family, up to 1.8 meters long, hunting in family groups and so loud and vocal that biologists have cataloged more than 20 distinct calls. And there are the jaguars. Unlike Amazon jaguars, which are nearly impossible to spot in dense forest, the Pantanals hunt out in the open, along the riverbanks, in daylight. They specialize in caiman, taking reptiles that can weigh 100 kilograms with a single bite through the skull, often in the water. In 2020, the Pantanal burned in the worst fires on record. Around a third of it went up in a single year, with wildlife fleeing into rivers already full of caimans and anacondas. An estimated 17 million vertebrates died. The fires were set, mostly near the farming frontier, to clear land during a drought that made everything burn more easily than ever. Most of the jaguars survived. The Pantanal is recovering slowly, unevenly, the way it has recovered from every flood, drought, and fire in its history. It has been doing this for millions of years. The difference now is the fires, which are both the newest threat and the largest. Marajó Island, where the police ride buffalo. At the mouth of the Amazon, where the river meets the Atlantic, there's an island about the size of Switzerland. Some 40,000 square kilometers of flat floodplain, forest, and grassland. This is Marajó in the state of Pará, at the northeastern tip of Brazil. No bridges reach it. The only way in is by boat or small plane. And on this island, the police ride buffalo. Not horses, not motorcycles. Water buffalo. The reason is the water itself. For about half the year in the wet season, much of Marajó goes under. Horses struggle, motorcycles stop, and buffalo simply don't care. They push through floodwater, mud, and terrain no wheeled vehicle can manage. The Buffalo Patrol of Sour, its officers nicknamed the Buffalo Soldiers, grew out of that necessity a few decades ago. The buffalo themselves are said to have arrived by accident. By local legend, a ship carrying them from Asia, bound for one of the Guianas, sank in the waters around Marajó in the 19th century, and the animals, strong swimmers, made it to shore. They found an island with no natural predators, endless grass, and exactly the kind of flat, wet ground buffalo are built for, and they multiplied. Today, There are roughly 500,000 of them on Marajó, outnumbering the island's 440,000 or so people. They're everywhere, on the roads, in the towns, on the beaches, in the rivers. They're farmed for meat and milk, and Marajó buffalo cheese is a regional delicacy sold across Brazil. They're ridden too, by police, by farmers, by children who grew up treating them roughly the way other children treat bicycles. The island also holds something much older. Between about 400 BC and 1300 AD, a sophisticated pre-Columbian society, the Marajoara, flourished here, building complex communities and large earthworks on this flat, flooded land before fading away long before Europeans arrived. What they left behind is ceramic art of remarkable sophistication, still being pulled from the ground today. So Marajó is an island where a shipwreck reshaped the ecosystem, where the police ride the descendants of drowned cargo, where an ancient civilization built something and vanished, and where, in the end, the buffalo outnumber the people. Christ the Redeemer, the statue that watches everything. It stands about 700 meters above the sea, on top of Corcovado Mountain, looking out over Rio de Janeiro. To one side are the wealthy beaches of Ipanema and Leblon, where apartments cost more per square meter than in much of Paris. To the other is Rocinha, the largest favela in Brazil. Tin roofs and narrow alleys and tens of thousands of people who could never afford the apartments at the foot of the same mountain the statue stands on. Directly below is the city itself, both versions of it at once. The rich Rio and the poor Rio, the beachfront Rio and the hillside Rio. The statue takes in both and always has. This is Cristo Redentor, Christ the Redeemer, 38 meters tall, counting its pedestal, and weighing around 635 tons. It was built between 1922 and 1931, designed by the Brazilian engineer Heitor da Silva Costa, with the face sculpted by the French artist Paul Landowski, and paid for largely by Brazilian Catholics who wanted a monument that could be seen from anywhere in the city. It can be. On clear days, it's visible from a long way off across Rio. It's since become the symbol of Brazil, on the postcards, in the tourism campaigns, the open arms among the most reproduced images in the country's history. And those arms face everything at once. Ipanema and Rocinha, the bay and the favelas, the whole of Rio without picking a side. The statue doesn't choose what it sees. What does get chosen is the framing. When Brazil shows you the statue, it usually shows you just the statue and the view, and leaves the rest of the picture out. Manaus, the opera house in the jungle. About 1,500 kilometers up the Amazon from the Atlantic, in the middle of the rainforest, reachable by river or by air, but not by road, there is an opera house. Not a modest provincial theater, but a grand one. Its dome covered in some 36,000 painted ceramic tiles shipped from Alsace and laid in the colors of the Brazilian flag. This is the Teatro Amazonas, built in Manaus and opened in 1896 at the height of the rubber boom, when the city was briefly one of the richest places on earth. The Amazon basin then held a near monopoly on natural rubber before synthetic rubber existed, and before seeds smuggled out of Brazil in the 1870s were grown into vast plantations in Southeast Asia. For a few decades, the rubber barons of Manaus were among the wealthiest men alive. The era's most repeated story has them sending their laundry to Europe to be washed, the local water supposedly not being good enough. Probably more legend than fact, but a telling one. They built mansions and imported Italian marble, Portuguese tiles, English ironwork, and French furniture. And they built the Opera House, pulling its luxuries from across Europe, marble from Italy, glass chandeliers from Venice, ironwork from England, the dome tiles from France, all of it carried up the river to the middle of the jungle. The people who actually built it, indigenous workers and poor migrants, earned almost nothing, and many died of the diseases the rubber trade carried with it. The boom collapsed once the Asian plantations began turning out cheaper rubber around 1912. The Opera House stayed. Today it still hosts performances. The Amazonas Philharmonic plays inside it, ringed by the forest that was there long before the theater and will outlast it. Meeting of waters, Rio Negro and Amazon. Two rivers meet at Manaus. One is the Rio Negro, black, though up close it's really the dark brown of strong tea, acidic and slow-moving. The other is the Solimões, the upper Amazon, which arrives here a pale, muddy yellow, faster and colder, heavy with sediment. They meet, and they don't mix. For about 6 kilometers downstream, the two run side by side, black on one side and yellow-brown on the other, with a clear line between them, not a thin seam but a sharp boundary, kilometers wide. Then slowly, they merge. The reason is straightforward physics. The two rivers differ in density, temperature, speed, and chemistry. The Negro is warm, acidic, and low in nutrients, stained dark by dissolved organic matter, rotting vegetation washed out of the forest, and so poor in life that it carries few fish and famously few mosquitoes. The Solimões is cooler, more alkaline and rich in nutrients. Loaded with sediment, it has carried thousands of kilometers down from the Andes. Where they touch, the difference is too great for them to blend at once. So they hold their separate colors side by side until the distance finally wears the boundary away. Scientists call it a hydrological phenomenon, the meeting of the waters. The tourists who come out by boat from Manaus tend to call it one of the strangest things they've ever seen. A line drawn across a river that looks like it shouldn't hold, and somehow does. Fernando de Noronha, the island you need permission to visit. To visit Fernando de Noronha, you need permission. Not a visa or a booking, but an environmental permit. The number of people allowed on the island at once is capped, and a daily conservation tax climbs the longer you stay, deliberately discouraging long visits to keep the crowd below the level that would start to wear the place down. The place is an archipelago of 21 islands and islets in the Atlantic, about 350 kilometers off the northeastern coast of Brazil. The water is among the clearest in the South Atlantic, with visibility that can reach 50 meters. and the marine life is extraordinary. The bays here hold one of the largest gatherings of spinner dolphins anywhere. Hundreds of them most mornings, swimming in formation and twisting through the air as they leap. Hawksbill turtles nest on the beaches every year, in one of the most important nesting populations in the South Atlantic. And reef sharks cruise the shallows, almost entirely indifferent to the divers sharing the water with them. The island was uninhabited when the Portuguese reached it in the early 1500s. Later, it became a prison, including for political prisoners, one of the most remote in Brazil's history. And some of those buildings still stand. During the Second World War, it even served as a military base. Today, it's one of the most expensive destinations in the country. The environmental tax alone can cost more than the flight to reach it. The expense is the point. It's the price of keeping a fragile Atlantic archipelago intact, not by leaving it alone, but by carefully limiting how many people get to enjoy it at once. Selarón Steps, Rio de Janeiro. In 1990, a Chilean artist named Jorge Selarón, who had settled years earlier in the Lapa district of Rio de Janeiro, started fixing up the crumbling staircase outside his house. The steps were a mess, cracked tiles, broken treads, long neglected, and he simply began covering them with whatever tiles he could find or afford. He had almost no money. He sold paintings to buy more and scavenged discarded tiles from building sites and the streets. Then people started sending him tiles from all over, eventually from some 60 countries. Each one carried a small story. Tourists who'd visited once and never forgotten, strangers who'd heard about the Chilean artist in Rio tiling a staircase with the world. The finished work runs 215 steps and more than 2,000 tiles. The green, yellow, and blue of the Brazilian flag dominating, with pieces from every continent worked in. Selarón called it his tribute to the Brazilian people and said it would only be finished on the day he died. He turned out to be right. On January 10th, 2013, he was found dead on the steps. At 65, his body burned. The case was never resolved cleanly. He had received death threats and some suspected foul play, but the police investigation leaned toward suicide, and friends said he'd fallen into a deep depression in his final weeks. No clear, agreed answer ever emerged. The staircase is now one of the most photographed places in Rio, with millions of visitors a year and the tiles catching the sun. Selarón is buried nearby. He left no family behind, only the steps and his name on them. If any of this brings up something heavy for you, it's worth reaching out to someone you trust or a local support line. You don't have to sit with it alone. Trans-Amazon Highway, the road to nowhere. In 1972, Brazil's military government opened a project meant to change everything. A highway across the Amazon, some 4,000 kilometers long, running east to west straight through the largest rainforest on Earth. The Transamazônica, BR-230. The pitch was a slogan: a land without people for a people without land. The logic seemed simple. Build the road, and settlers would come and farm it. The land would feed the nation, the Amazon would turn productive, and Brazil would rise. The government planned to settle around 100,000 families along the route and drew people from the drought-stricken northeast and the crowded south, from anywhere with too many people and too little land. And the road did get built, fast, pushed through jungle and across rivers and over ground roads aren't supposed to cross. Then it went wrong. Amazon's soil looks rich but isn't. The nutrients are held in the trees, and once the trees are cleared, the rain washes those nutrients away, leaving thin, acidic clay that grows almost nothing. The settlers who came found their crops failing, disease spreading, the roads dissolving every rainy season, and the support they'd been promised slow to arrive or never arriving at all. Far fewer families came than planned, and most of those who did eventually left. The highway was largely left too. Br-230 still appears on every map of Brazil, but much of it has never been paved. Long stretches are dirt that turns impassable in the wet season, trucks bogged down in the mud for days. And in places the forest has crept back over the roadbed entirely. The road that was supposed to open the Amazon to settlement was, in much of its length, quietly absorbed back into it. Manaus, the floating city on the Rio Negro. The Rio Negro at Manaus rises and falls by around 10 meters over the course of a year, in big years closer to 14. And it does it not as a disaster, but as a season, as routine as summer turning to winter. For about 6 months, the river climbs and floods the edges of the city. For the other 6, it draws back, and the people who live on the water rise and fall with it. This is the floating edge of Manaus. The palafitas, stilt houses, and floating platforms linked by wooden walkways that flex with the current. There are thousands of them along the margin of one of the largest cities in the Amazon, a place of some 2 million people with skyscrapers, a famous opera house, highways, and airports. And around its edges, houses on water that have been here longer than the highways have. The construction is clever. The platforms float on logs. So as the water rises, they rise, and as it falls, they fall. And the walkways between them are forever being adjusted. Neighbors 2 meters apart across the water in June can be 10 meters apart by January. The same neighborhood, with a different geography almost daily. The river is the road. Small wooden boats are the taxis, the ferries, the delivery vans, and the ambulances. A child growing up here learns to get around by water before learning to do it on land. The markets on the floating platforms sell river fish still alive in buckets, caught that morning by fishermen who live on the same platforms, who have worked these waters all their lives, as their fathers did. And when the water is high, the forest comes into the city. Trees that normally stand on dry land stand in 10 meters of water, and pink river dolphins move between them and in among the houses, not really as visitors, but as part of the place, as they were long before the city was here. Jericoacoara, the village without asphalt slash. There are no paved roads in Jericoacoara. The streets are sand, the main square is sand. The paths between the guest houses are sand. To get here at all, you leave the paved road and cross the dunes for about an hour in a 4x4 or a buggy. There's no other way in. Jericoacoara sits on the northwestern coast of Ceará, in northeastern Brazil. The dune that overlooks the village is where everyone gathers in the evening to watch the sunset. It isn't a dramatic dune, not 300 meters high, just a medium one with a clear line to the horizon. But every evening people climb it, sit, and watch the sun drop into the sea. When it vanishes, they clap, as if applauding the end of the day. The lagoons here are made for kite surfing. Steady wind, shallow water, conditions counted among the best in the world for it. Kite surfers come from Europe, North America, everywhere, for the wind. And the village has grown up around them, restaurants, guest houses, yoga studios. But it has kept the no pavement rule. That's less about tradition than about protection. Jericoacoara sits inside a national park, and the unpaved streets are part of keeping the dunes and the landscape that drew people here in the first place from being built over and destabilized. So the streets stay sand, and the only way in is still across the dunes, by 4x4 or buggy. It's inconvenient, which is more or less the point. Amazon, the pink dolphins. They're pink. Not faintly pink, not pink in a certain light, properly pink. The color of bubble gum, which is not a color you expect to surface in a river. This is the boto, the Amazon river dolphin, the largest river dolphin on Earth, reaching up to 2.5 meters and 185 kilograms. It lives only in the rivers of the Amazon and Orinoco basins and nowhere else. The dolphins are born gray and turn pinker with age. The males are pinker than the females, and the most dominant of them, the pinkest of all. The color comes from blood vessels close to the skin, along with scar tissue from fighting, and it flushes brighter with excitement, feeding, and conflict. In the wet season, when the Amazon rises and pushes up into the trees, the boto swims into the flooded forest itself, threading between the trunks after fish no other predator can follow. Amazonian people have told stories about the boto for centuries. In the most famous, the dolphin turns at night into a handsome man, dressed in white, who comes to the parties, charms and seduces the women, and slips away before dawn back to the river. A child born with no known father is sometimes called the botos. For a long time, the legend protected the animal. Nobody wanted to kill something that might, in some sense, be human. That protection is fading. Fishermen now kill boto for bait to catch a catfish called piracatinga, which is sold in Brazilian markets and exported. Boat traffic injures the dolphins. Mercury from illegal gold mining works its way up the food chain, and dams cut across their migration routes. The population is falling, though no one can say exactly how fast. The river system is too vast and tangled to count dolphins with any precision. The stories are still told, and the boto still moves through the flooded forest each wet season. There are just fewer of them every year. In Hotim, the art museum in the jungle. There's a place in Brazil where you walk through tropical forest and come upon a Damien Hirst between the trees. then a Jeff Koons, then a Doug Aitken, then a Tunga installation in a building designed around it. This is in Hotim, in the municipality of Brumadinho in Minas Gerais, a few hours from São Paulo, one of the largest open-air contemporary art museums in the world. It spreads across thousands of hectares of Atlantic forest, with botanical gardens holding some 5,000 plant species, and art set not on walls or in ordinary galleries, but in the landscape itself, in pavilions designed by leading architects for specific works that will never move. Matthew Barney has a pavilion here. So do Chris Burden, Helio Oititsika, and artists from dozens of countries. The collection was put together by Bernardo Paz, a Brazilian mining magnate who started buying art in the 1980s and eventually decided his estate wasn't enough, that the work needed more space, more light, more forest around it. He opened Inhotim to the public in 2006, with entry kept affordable for Brazilians and free on certain days, on the principle that art shouldn't be only for people who can pay. In 2017, Paz was convicted of money laundering and sentenced to 9 years. The museum carried on without him, and in 2020 the conviction was overturned and he was acquitted. The art stayed where it was throughout, built into its buildings, with the forest grown up around it. A short distance away, in the same municipality, is the site of the Brumadinho Dam disaster. On January 25, 2019, a tailings dam at a Vale iron ore mine collapsed and sent millions of cubic meters of mud down the valley, killing 272 people, among them workers buried at lunch in the mine's cafeteria. In Hotim, roughly 10 kilometers off, was evacuated as a precaution. The mud flow never reached it, but more than 40 of its staff were related to people who died. So one municipality holds two things at once. One of the most remarkable open-air museums anywhere, and the site of the worst mining disaster in Brazil's history. Both built, in the end, on the same iron-rich ground. São Luís, the city that forgot to save itself. The tiles are everywhere, on every building, every facade. Blue and white, green and white, multicolored, geometric patterns, floral ones, scenes from Portuguese history. This is São Luís, capital of Maranhão, in northeastern Brazil. Its historic center is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and holds what's often called the largest concentration of Portuguese azulejo tiles anywhere outside Portugal. Thousands of buildings from the colonial era, each faced with tiles shipped over from Portugal and the Netherlands to decorate the houses of the local elite. From the street, it's one of the most beautiful colonial centers in the Americas. From the inside, many of those same buildings are falling apart. The tiles are still magnificent. The structures behind them are crumbling. Roofs have caved in, floors have given way, and buildings that have stood for 2 or 3 centuries are being lost. Not to war or disaster, but to slow neglect. Families live inside them anyway, under ceilings that might come down, beside walls whose cracks widen with every rainy season, where water gets in, and the tiles that were meant to protect the building lose their hold and drop into the street. The government has designated the center a preservation zone, but the money to actually restore it has largely never arrived. and the people living there can't afford to rebuild houses the Portuguese put up 300 years ago. So the buildings stand, sheathed in tiles that detach one by one from walls that are quietly turning to rubble. It's a World Heritage Site in name, but heritage status doesn't pay for a new roof. The problem was never really the architecture. It's a city too poor to keep up the beauty it inherited. Brasília, the city built in 41 months. In 1956, the president of Brazil decided to move the capital away from Rio de Janeiro, the coastal colonial city of carnival and favelas and sea, and out onto the empty plateau of the country's interior, 1,000 kilometers inland, where there was essentially nothing. No village, no road, no building. The reasons were political: to push development into the interior, to move the center of the country to its actual center, to make something new. Juscelino Kubitschek handed the project to the urban planner Lucio Costa and the architect Oscar Niemeyer, and they designed a whole city from scratch, laid out, seen from above, in a shape people read as an aeroplane or bird in flight. Everything was intentional. The National Congress is two towers standing between two domes, one concave, one convex, the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies, opposites in a single composition. The presidential palace sits on a reflecting pool, its outer columns curving like hands folded in prayer. The cathedral is 16 curved columns rising to a point, like hands reaching up, or a crown of thorns. Every building was meant to be in conversation with the others, and the whole thing went up in about 41 months. The workers came from all over Brazil, many of them poor migrants from the northeast, the Candangos, who built the city by hand, lived in camps outside the construction zone, and were promised homes in the new capital once it was done. When it was done, they weren't given homes in the planned city. They were moved out to satellite towns on the edges. The city they had built for others wasn't built for them. Brasília was inaugurated in 1960, and Rio stopped being the capital. The government moved, the diplomats moved, the civil servants moved. And almost at once the place started doing what utopias tend to do, meeting reality and bending to it. The plane-shaped plan held the center. The people it had no room for settled the edges, and the gap between the ideal and the lived city has been part of Brasília ever since. Sugarloaf Mountain, Rio de Janeiro. Some cities are defined by what they built. New York by its skyline, Paris by its tower, Sydney by its opera house. Rio de Janeiro is defined by something it didn't build at all: a rock. Pão de Açúcar, Sugarloaf Mountain, is 396 meters of bare granite rising straight out of the edge of Guanabara Bay. The name comes from the shape of the molds that refined sugar was set in back in the 16th century. The same rounded, tapering silhouette. From the water, it's the first thing arriving ships see, and has been since the Portuguese sailed into the bay in 1502. They weren't the first here, though. The Tupi, who already lived on these shores, had their own name for it, and one account traces Pão de Açúcar back to Tupi words the Portuguese heard, half understood and reshaped into the sugarloaf they knew. A cable car has run up it since 1912, one of the earliest in the world. The original wooden cabins were replaced decades later, and the present system climbs in 2 stages, first to Morro da Urca and then to the summit. From the top, the whole city opens out. Copacabana to the south with Ipanema beyond, the favelas on the hillsides, Niterói across the bay, the Maracanã in the distance, and Christ the Redeemer standing arms open on Corcovado. It's all laid out below at once, the beaches and the hillsides, the wealth and the poverty, the easy parts of Rio and the hard ones. And all of it sits at the foot of a single rock that was here long before any of it and will outlast all of it. The granite of Sugarloaf is hundreds of millions of years old. The city around it is not yet 500. The rock was here far longer before and will go on far longer after. Chapada Diamantina, Cachoeira da Fumaça. The water never reaches the bottom. It pours over the cliff edge and falls some 340 meters. And somewhere on the way down, it simply disappears. The wind catches it and breaks it apart into mist, a column of white that drifts back up even as the water comes down. This is Cachoeira da Fumaça, the smoke waterfall in Chapada Diamantina National Park in the state of Bahia, in the interior of Brazil's northeast. It's one of the tallest waterfalls in the country, and unlike the usual kind, where water falls into a pool, into a river, on toward the sea, this one mostly turns to vapor on the way. The cliff and the valley below generate a strong updraft, and in the dry season, when the river above has slowed to a thread, that rising air is enough to catch the thin fall and push it back into mist before it ever lands. In the driest months, the river slows almost to nothing. The 340-meter fall thins to a trickle and then stops altogether. For a stretch of the year, there's no waterfall at all, just the cliff and the memory of the smoke. Then the rains come back, the river fills, and the water falls again and vanishes again into the same air it's been falling into for a very long time. Chapada Diamantina sits on ancient rock, quartzite and sandstone laid down over 1 billion years ago. The diamond hunters who came in the 18th century looking for gems found all this instead. The waterfalls, the rivers, the caves, the canyons. The diamonds were eventually worked out. The waterfalls weren't. Brazil showed us everything it is. The largest favela in Latin America, 5 minutes from the most expensive beach. A rainforest producing oxygen for the planet, being burned to make room for cattle. An opera house in the middle of the jungle, built on rubber and suffering. A highway that was going to open the Amazon, swallowed by the trees it cut through. A river killed in an afternoon by a company that still operates. A tribe of 32,000 people poisoned by miners looking for gold in their rivers. A man who spent 23 years building a staircase for a city that wasn't his, and died on it. A floating city that rises and falls 14 meters with the river every year. A capital built in 41 months in an empty field that became everything utopias always become. A waterfall that disappears into the air before it reaches the ground. A rock 600 million years old that watches everything below it change. Brazil is not a country. It is an argument between the Brazil it could be and the Brazil it is, between the forest and the fire, between the opera house and the mud, between the beach and the favela. That argument has been going on for 500 years. It has not been resolved. Subscribe, because it is still happening.